The dawn in Mexico City used to bring with it a fast pace, the echoes of cars flooding the streets, and the first rays of sunlight sneaking between the tall buildings. However, at the entrance of the luxurious Real Palace Hotel, Santiago Gonzalez lived a different routine, a calmness that contrasted with the external hustle. Santiago, a dark-skinned man with gray hair and a face marked by the years, had been at his post since 6 in the morning. His imposing figure, dressed in a dark blue doorman's uniform, always perfectly pressed, was a symbol of the place. At 70 years old, Santiago had become a legend among the employees. Everyone respected him not only for his long tenure at the hotel but also for his unshakable work ethic. There was something solemn in his stride. Despite the years he carried on his shoulders, his posture remained firm, his movements meticulous. He knew exactly where to stand to greet guests, how to open doors with a fluid and elegant gesture, how to move heavy luggage without apparent effort. It didn't matter if it was a scorching hot day or a rainy afternoon, Santiago was always there, a constant presence in the lives of those who frequented the Real Palace. His presence was like a Swiss clock, punctual, reliable. Mornings always began with Santiago's courteous greeting to the first guests leaving the hotel, many of them businesspeople in impeccable suits who greeted him with familiarity. Some knew him by name, others offered only a hurried smile, but all knew that Santiago would always be there, with that calm gaze and a soft yet firm voice. He had seen generations of guests pass through those doors, from honeymoon couples to entire families arriving to celebrate special occasions. The Real Palace Hotel was no ordinary hotel, it was a symbol of tradition and elegance in the city. Its gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and Persian carpets that covered the ground told a story of better times. Santiago knew this because he had been there for nearly 40 years, watching how the place evolved, how it adapted, but always maintaining its essence. The hotel represented more than just a job to him. It was his life, his home. His father had been a bellboy at the same hotel, and Santiago had grown up admiring his father's work. In a way, he had felt that maintaining the family tradition was his destiny. However, times were changing. Management had seen several directors come and go over the years, but none had been as disruptive as Alejandro Castillo, the new manager who had arrived just a few days ago. Alejandro's arrival brought with it a sense of unease that quickly spread among the staff. A young man, barely in his 30s, with impeccable academic credentials and a reputation as a ruthless modernizer. It was said he had turned rundown hotels into trendy spots, but at the cost of breaking the traditions that had kept them alive. Santiago had observed him from a distance. Alejandro had arrived at the hotel in a luxury sports car, wearing sunglasses and carrying an air of superiority that sharply contrasted with the quiet formality that characterized the Real Palace. He walked as if he owned the place, paying no attention to the employees who politely greeted him. There was something in his presence that unsettled Santiago, a hidden disdain, an arrogance that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Their first interaction was brief, but it left a deep mark on Santiago. That same afternoon, Alejandro approached him at the hotel entrance after spending the day touring the facilities and taking notes on his tablet. Santiago, true to his education and his position, stepped forward to introduce himself and offer his services, as he did with any important guest. "Good afternoon, Mr. Castillo. My name is Santiago Gonzalez, the hotel doorman. I'm at your service for whatever you need." Alejandro, without even removing his sunglasses, glanced at him from the corner of his eye. He didn't extend his hand, nor did he respond with words. He simply nodded briefly and continued on his way, leaving Santiago with his hand extended in the air. Santiago felt a slight discomfort in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years: humiliation. He wasn't a man who was easily intimidated, but there was something in that look, in that gesture of disdain, that had struck him deeply. The following days only confirmed what Santiago already feared. Alejandro was not a man who respected tradition. From his office on the top floor, he called several meetings with the staff to announce drastic changes to the hotel. He spoke of modern renovations, updating the decor, and attracting a younger clientele. Every word of his was like a dagger to Santiago. To Alejandro, the Real Palace Hotel was a place stuck in time, and his goal was to turn it into something completely new, without caring about the legacy behind it. The younger staff seemed excited by Alejandro's ideas, but the older employees, those like Santiago who had dedicated their lives to the hotel, were worried. In his meetings, Alejandro hinted at the need to rejuvenate the team, to make room for new generations. Although he never said it directly, it was clear that he saw Santiago and other veteran employees as relics of a past that didn't fit his vision. One afternoon, as Santiago was helping an elderly couple with their luggage, Alejandro passed by, accompanied by a group of investors who had come to discuss future renovations. Santiago overheard fragments of the conversation. "This place has potential, but it's full of things that need to be changed. Staff that's past their prime, decor that looks like a museum. Everything needs to be modernized," Alejandro said, glancing sideways at Santiago. The comment felt like a slap in the face. Santiago didn't react outwardly, but inside, something broke. He felt he was being attacked, not just for his job but for everything he represented. Alejandro wasn't just dismissing the hotel, he was dismissing its history, Santiago's dedication, his very life. But Santiago wasn't a man who gave up easily. Despite the comments, the disdainful looks, and the insinuations about his age, he continued doing his job with the same care as always. He knew that some of the younger employees looked at him with pity, others with admiration, but he sought neither. He only wanted to do his job, as he had always done, with the dignity his father had taught him. As Santiago watched the comings and goings of the guests, he felt that his time at the hotel was nearing its end. But it wouldn't be Alejandro who would drive him out. If he left, it would be by his own decision, when he felt his mission was complete, not when some arrogant young man told him he was no longer needed. He knew the coming days would be tough, that a confrontation with Alejandro was inevitable, but he was prepared. Because Santiago wasn't just a doorman, he was the heart and soul of the Real Palace Hotel. The atmosphere inside the Real Palace Hotel had changed since Alejandro Castillo's arrival. All the employees, from the housekeepers to the kitchen chefs, felt an invisible tension creeping through the halls, in the furtive glances, in the whispers of worry. The young manager had brought with him not only the promise of change but a sense of danger for those who had been there all their lives. He was a man who, although he didn't say it openly, despised the old, the outdated, and in his view, Santiago Gonzalez represented exactly that, a symbol of a past that needed to be erased. Alejandro wasn't a man who came to be part of something. He came to the Real Palace to make it his own, to impose his mark, his name, and his reputation on every corner. Barely a week had passed since his arrival, and he had already called a series of meetings with architects and designers to discuss renovations. Santiago watched it all from his usual post at the entrance, aware that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything he knew and loved about the hotel. One morning, just after 9 o'clock, Alejandro appeared in the lobby with a group of investors. They walked around him as if he were the central figure, gesturing enthusiastically while pointing at various parts of the lobby. Santiago couldn't help but overhear them as they passed by. "This place has potential, but it's outdated. The carpets, the furniture, even the staff, everything needs to be updated. To attract a younger crowd, we need something more modern, something more vibrant. We're already in talks for a complete renovation, Alejandro said authoritatively, not bothering to lower his voice. Santiago swallowed hard. He felt a pang of indignation every time he heard those words. To him, the hotel was more than a workplace, it was an extension of his own story. It was where he had spent his adult life, where he had met his wife, where he had raised his son. Alejandro, however, saw it simply as a business. And in that business, Santiago was just an old piece of furniture that needed to be replaced. Days passed, and it became increasingly clear that Alejandro was determined to make profound changes, even among the staff. The first casualties of his reforms were some of the older employees, especially those who didn't fit his modern vision. The first to be dismissed was Don Pedro, the cook who had been preparing the most exquisite dishes for hotel guests for nearly 30 years. Alejandro fired him with the excuse that he wanted to bring in a younger chef with more innovative ideas. The rumors of the firing spread through the halls like a cold wind, sowing fear among the employees who, like Santiago, were no longer young. It was on one of those cloudy mornings that Santiago had his first real confrontation with Alejandro. Santiago was at his usual post, helping a couple of tourists with their luggage, when Alejandro passed by. He was accompanied by a man in his 40s, dressed in an impeccable suit, and a group of young women, probably decorators or image consultants. Alejandro stopped, looking at Santiago's uniform as if it were a dirty rag that had no place in the hotel. "Santiago, right?" Alejandro asked, not bothering to look at him directly, keeping his eyes on his mobile phone as he gave instructions to someone via text. "Yes, Mr. Castillo," Santiago replied, maintaining his polite tone, though inside he felt a knot of tension in his stomach. Alejandro finally turned toward him, taking off his sunglasses and looking him up and down, as if evaluating an object that was out of place. "I've been reviewing a few things," Alejandro began, his voice laced with superiority. "And it seems to me that you've been here a long time, haven't you?" 40 years, sir," Santiago responded with pride, though not boasting. To him, those years represented dedication and loyalty, something that had always been valued at the hotel. But he knew Alejandro didn't see it that way. Alejandro let out a dry laugh, as if 40 years meant nothing. "That's a lifetime. But tell me, Santiago, haven't you thought about retiring?" he asked, without any delicacy. "The hotel is changing, we're modernizing everything, and sometimes the old has to make way for the new. Maybe it's time you considered stepping aside." Santiago felt a blow to his chest. For years, he had imagined that the day of his retirement would come someday, but he had never thought it would be forced. He looked Alejandro straight in the eye, maintaining his composure, though inside he felt deep discomfort. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Castillo, but I still have a lot to offer the hotel. This place is my home, and as long as I can keep working, I will stay here." Alejandro smiled with disdain, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned away without saying anything else, as if the conversation no longer mattered to him, and continued his tour of the hotel, pointing out the changes he planned to make. The humiliation burned inside Santiago. He wasn't a man who was easily intimidated, but Alejandro's words had touched a wound he didn't know existed. Never before had he felt that his place in the hotel was at risk, never had he doubted his importance there. But now, with a manager who saw him as a relic, Santiago wondered how much longer he could hold on. He knew he couldn't stay forever, but he didn't want to leave on those terms, with the feeling of having been pushed out by someone who didn't understand or respect the history of the place. As the days passed, Alejandro began to make more visible changes. Some of the old paintings in the lobby were removed, replaced with modern art that, according to him, would attract a younger crowd. The restaurant menus changed, adopting a minimalist style that many of the older guests didn't appreciate. But the worst came when Alejandro started pressuring more employees to retire voluntarily. Some, feeling the pressure and fearing for their jobs, decided to leave before they were fired. One morning, Santiago was at the entrance, brushing off his jacket after a light rain, when one of the younger employees, Tomas, a 22-year-old bellboy, approached him with a worried expression. "Mr. Santiago, I need to tell you something," Tomas whispered, nervously glancing toward Alejandro's office. Santiago paused and looked at him curiously. "What is it, son?" he asked, feeling that something bad was coming. "The boss." "Alejandro," Tomas paused, swallowing hard. "I was helping out in the administration office, and I overheard that they want to offer you a compensation package to retire." Santiago remained silent. He had already suspected it, but hearing it from someone else, especially a young man like Tomas, made him feel a sting of betrayal. Tomas looked at him with compassion, as if he had already accepted that Santiago's time at the hotel was running out. "Thank you for telling me, Tomas," Santiago replied, trying to sound calm. But inside, his mind was in chaos. He knew this was just the beginning, that Alejandro wouldn't stop until he got rid of everything that represented the hotel's past. However, Santiago had no intention of leaving without a fight. It wasn't just his job at stake, it was his dignity, his legacy, his history. And he wasn't going to let a man like Alejandro take that from him so easily. The days following his conversation with Alejandro were tense for Santiago. He knew the new manager saw him as an obstacle to his modernization plans, but Santiago was not a man to be easily bent by the first strong wind. Over the years, he had learned to weather the storms, the difficulties life and society had thrown his way for being a black man in a world that often didn't offer respect to people of his condition. This wasn't the first time he had felt the contempt of someone younger and more powerful, but this time was different. This time, his entire life, his very purpose, was under threat. The hotel was his home. Every detail, every stone, and every corner reminded him of his own story. He had started as a bellboy when he was just 20. Over time, he had risen through the ranks due to his discipline and dedication. The previous manager, Mr. Julio, had valued him as an indispensable member of the hotel and had praised his ability to treat guests with the perfect combination of respect and warmth. Santiago was known for remembering regular clients' names, knowing their preferences, and personal details. He was more than just a doorman, he was part of the experience that the real palace offered. Now, with Alejandro in charge, everything seemed to be unraveling. The modernization he proposed didn't just affect the furniture or decor, it seemed aimed at uprooting any trace of the past, including Santiago. However, despite the biting comments, the racist insinuations, and the increasingly evident pressure, Santiago held on to his dignity. One afternoon, while helping a guest load luggage into a car, Santiago saw Alejandro walking through the lobby. The manager watched him from afar with that same disdain as always, as if every move Santiago made reminded him of what he considered obsolete. Nonetheless, Santiago paid him no mind. He did his job as usual, ensuring every suitcase was in place and that the guest left with a grateful smile. However, as the guest left, Alejandro approached. His presence was like a cold shadow stretching over Santiago. "You're still here, huh?" Alejandro murmured, with a smile that had nothing friendly about it. I'm surprised you haven't taken the offer we made to you in administration. Santiago looked at him calmly. He knew it was only a matter of time before Alejandro confronted him directly. But he wasn't going to back down. I've dedicated my life to this place, Mr. Castillo. I'm not going to leave just like that. His voice was firm but respectful. There was no anger in his words, just the truth of a man who knew his place. Alejandro narrowed his eyes, as if measuring Santiago's response. And what do you think you're going to achieve by staying here? Alejandro asked. This hotel is changing, whether you like it or not. There's no room for the past in my vision of the future. Maybe it's time you think about yourself, your well-being. You don't have to keep dragging yourself through these halls like you're some kind of relic. There are other things you could be doing, things more suitable for someone your age. The word relic echoed in Santiago's ears. He could feel the humiliation Alejandro intended to inflict, but he wouldn't let it break him. He kept his posture, though inside his heart was racing. I don't drag myself through these halls, Mr. Castillo, Santiago replied, looking Alejandro straight in the eye. I walk through them with pride. Because while you see this place as a business, I see it as my home. And in my home, I don't retire just because someone thinks I'm no longer useful. Alejandro seemed surprised by Santiago's response. Perhaps he had expected immediate submission, an acceptance of his superiority. But what he encountered was a wall of dignity that couldn't be torn down with mere words. That's something that's no longer up to you, Santiago, Alejandro said coldly. The decisions of who stays or goes are no longer in your hands. If you want to make this easier on yourself, you should consider taking the compensation offer. Otherwise, we could handle things in a more formal way. Alejandro's words were a barely veiled threat. Santiago understood them perfectly. He knew his time at the hotel was limited, at least in Alejandro's terms. But he wasn't going to allow himself to be pushed out without a fight. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Castillo, Santiago responded, his calm tone masking the anger inside. But I'm not ready to leave this place. Not yet. Alejandro pressed his lips together, clearly frustrated by Santiago's resistance. But he said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Santiago at the entrance, feeling the weight of the conflict that was brewing. Santiago knew this battle wouldn't be easy. Alejandro had the power, the control over administrative decisions, and it was clear he wouldn't stop until he removed everything that didn't fit his modern vision. But Santiago had something Alejandro didn't understand: the loyalty of many employees and the respect of guests who had been attended to by him for decades. In the days that followed, Santiago began to notice small gestures of support from his colleagues. Maria, the receptionist, was one of those who always greeted him with a smile, but now, her concern was evident. Mr. Santiago, she said one afternoon as he took a brief break in the lobby. I've heard some things in the administration office. They say Alejandro is looking for reasons to fire more employees. I think you're on his radar. Santiago nodded, though he already knew. I know, Maria, he replied. But I won't let them throw me out without a fight. Maria looked at him with admiration and a bit of sadness. You've always been an example to all of us, Mr. Santiago. I don't want you to leave. I won't, Santiago said with a light smile. Not until it's necessary. The support of Maria and other employees like her gave Santiago newfound strength. He knew he wasn't alone. Younger employees like Tomas, the bellboy, and some of the cleaning staff also showed their respect in subtle ways, ensuring that Santiago knew not everyone was on Alejandro's side. However, the tension continued to rise. Every day, Alejandro made it more apparent that he wanted Santiago gone. New employees, hired under Alejandro's supervision, began to appear on the daytime shifts, and some of Santiago's old colleagues were no longer there. The atmosphere became colder and more professional, and the camaraderie that had existed for years started to fade. One afternoon, while Santiago was at the door, he saw his son Javier arrive at the hotel. Javier was a 35-year-old man, tall and serious-faced. He worked as an architect at a major firm in the city, and his life was so busy that he rarely had time to visit his father at work. Santiago smiled when he saw him, though his smile held a hint of nostalgia. He knew Javier led a very different life from his own, a more modern life, distant from the past that Santiago had known. Javier approached his father with a concerned expression. "Dad, I heard what's going on here," Javier said bluntly. "I've heard rumors about this Alejandro. They say he's trying to get rid of you." Santiago nodded, knowing there was no way to hide the truth. "That's right, son," he replied calmly. "But I'm not leaving without a fight." Javier looked at him with admiration but also with concern. "Dad, you don't have to put up with this. If they want you to retire, you could do it with dignity. You don't have to wait until they fire you." But Santiago shook his head. "I won't leave like that, Javier. This place is a part of me, and I won't let them push me out as if I meant nothing. I'm not just another employee. I've worked here my whole life. And as long as I can, I'll stay." Javier sighed, understanding his father's stubbornness. He knew that once Santiago made up his mind, nothing and no one could change it. But he also knew the coming battle wouldn't be easy, and he feared what Alejandro might do. "If you need my help, I'm here," Javier said finally. "You're not alone, Dad." Santiago looked at him with gratitude, knowing that his son's words meant more than Javier himself realized. Even though Javier had taken a different path in life, he was still Santiago's son, and that connection between them was something neither time nor Alejandro could break. Santiago's fight to maintain his dignity was far from over, but now, with the support of his son and his colleagues, he felt he had more strength to face whatever came. The days at the Real Palace Hotel passed under a constant atmosphere of tension. Alejandro continued imposing his cold, calculating style, slowly replacing loyal employees with new faces, younger people who followed his orders without question. However, Santiago was not alone in this silent battle. The employees who had known him for years, those who had worked alongside him, began to organize in his defense. Maria, the receptionist, was one of the first to notice that something deeper was brewing in Alejandro's mind. She worked behind the large marble counter, greeting guests with the same warmth that had always characterized the hotel, but her eyes were constantly attentive to Alejandro's actions and those of his collaborators. She knew that the situation with Santiago reflected something much larger. Alejandro's attitude wasn't just a matter of modernization, it was loaded with prejudice and disdain for what Santiago represented: tradition, hard work, and a sense of belonging. Maria, with her dark hair always neatly tied in a bun and her soft but firm voice, began to speak with other employees. The conversations took place in the corners of the lobby, in the service hallways, or in the small staff cafeteria. There, complaints and worries multiplied. It wasn't just Santiago who was suffering under Alejandro's pressure. Other veteran employees felt they were also in danger, that their seniority and loyalty to the hotel were now seen as weaknesses rather than virtues. One afternoon, while Maria was resting in the staff room, she gathered with some of the employees who also shared concerns about Santiago. Tomás, the young bellboy, was there, as well as Clara, one of the cleaning supervisors, and Pablo, the maintenance manager. The group, though small, shared an unbreakable loyalty to Santiago and to what the Real Palace Hotel had meant to them for so many years. Maria, in her calm but determined voice, explained what everyone feared. They knew Alejandro wouldn't stop until he got rid of Santiago, and then he would come after them. The new manager had made veiled racist comments, criticizing Santiago not only for his age but for his background, suggesting that the hotel needed a more modern, cleaner image to attract new clients. It was clear that Santiago, with his dark skin and dignified posture, didn't fit into that vision. Clara, who had worked at the hotel almost as long as Santiago, couldn't hide her indignation. She vividly remembered how Santiago had helped her when she started as a nervous young woman in her first job. He had always been kind, willing to teach newcomers how to navigate that grand marble palace. Now, seeing him being humiliated in such a way by someone who didn't even understand what the hotel meant filled her with contained rage. Tomás, although younger and newer compared to the others, also felt deep respect for Santiago. He clearly remembered how the veteran doorman had been the first to speak to him when he arrived nervously for his first day at work. Santiago had taken him under his wing, teaching him not only the tricks of the trade but also the importance of doing the job with pride and humility. Seeing him now under constant attack affected him deeply. Pablo, the maintenance manager, joined the conversation after hearing the rumors about what Alejandro was planning. Although he was a man of few words, his loyalty to Santiago was undeniable. He knew that, as head of maintenance, his position could also be at risk if Alejandro decided he no longer needed bold employees. His silent fury grew, but his determination was firm. He wouldn't let Santiago fall alone. During those secret meetings, the employees began to draw up a plan. They knew they couldn't confront Alejandro directly without risking being fired, but there was another way to fight: the support of the guests. Many of the hotel's clients were regulars, families and businesspeople who visited the Real Palace every year. And Santiago had forged a special relationship with many of them. The employees decided that the best way to pressure Alejandro would be through those very clients. If they could get the guests to express their discontent with the idea of Santiago being fired, Alejandro might be forced to reconsider his stance. Maria took the initiative. She began speaking subtly with some of the older guests, those who had known Santiago for years. In casual conversations, she mentioned how Santiago was being pressured to retire, suggesting that the hotel might be considering changes in the staff. The guests, many of whom had come to appreciate Santiago for his warm treatment and prodigious memory, were dismayed. Maria listened to their expressions of discontent, taking note of those who might be willing to intervene if things got worse. Meanwhile, Santiago continued to work, unaware of the details of what his colleagues were doing for him. Although he felt the growing pressure on his shoulders, he didn't let it affect his work. Every day he showed up on time, with his impeccable uniform, and performed his tasks with the same dedication that had always characterized him. He helped guests with a smile, remembered the names of their children, asked about their families, and made each one feel special. It was his way of resisting, of showing Alejandro that he wouldn't be defeated so easily. One afternoon, Santiago was helping a couple of elderly guests who had been visiting the hotel for over 20 years. The man, a retired business magnate, had developed a special friendship with Santiago over the years. As Santiago helped them with their luggage, the man stopped and looked at him closely. Santiago, the magnate said with a voice filled with respect and concern, "I've heard some troubling things about the new management. I don't like what they're doing here." Santiago looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. He knew his days at the hotel might be numbered, but he had never expected the guests to step in on his behalf. The magnate gave him a serious look before adding that if anything happened to Santiago, he and his family would never return to the hotel, a threat that would surely resonate in the upper management offices. That was just the first step in a series of supportive gestures from regular guests. Small comments in the hallways, subtle complaints at the front desk, and even handwritten notes expressing their dissatisfaction with the direction the hotel was taking began to emerge. Maria and the other employees knew they were walking a fine line, but each of those acts was a ray of hope. However, Alejandro wasn't a man easily intimidated. The tension grew, and everyone knew that at any moment, Alejandro could make his final move against Santiago. But the staff was determined not to leave him alone. Despite the fear they felt, they knew they had to stick together, because what was at stake wasn't just Santiago's job, but the very essence of the real Palace Hotel. The conflict between tradition and modernization was far from resolved, but in those moments of uncertainty, Santiago stood tall, his dignity intact, supported by those who saw him as much more than just a doorman. News of Alejandro's attempts to force Santiago out finally reached his son, Javier. Javier Gonzalez, a middle-aged man, had built a life of his own as an architect in a prestigious firm in Mexico City. Always busy, Javier didn't visit the real Palace Hotel often, but he felt deep respect for his father and the work he had done throughout his life. Although he didn't always understand Santiago's devotion to his job, he knew the hotel was much more than just a place of employment for his father. It was his legacy. One afternoon, Javier received a call from his mother, who told him about the changes happening at the hotel and the disrespectful treatment his father was receiving from Alejandro. The news left him stunned. He knew about the modern reforms being implemented in many hotels across the city, but he couldn't comprehend how someone like Alejandro could want to get rid of such a respected and valuable figure as his father. Javier's blood boiled as he listened to the details. It wasn't just a matter of work, it was a direct attack on the dignity and respect his father had earned over decades. Javier decided it was time to intervene. Though Santiago had always been a strong man, accustomed to facing adversity on his own, Javier knew this situation demanded more than just his father's quiet resistance. He needed to be part of the solution. After all, Santiago wasn't just facing a work problem, he was up against a system that sought to replace tradition with a modernization that lacked sensitivity and respect. The morning Javier decided to visit the hotel was unusually quiet. He walked into the lobby of the real palace with a determined stride, immediately noticing the small changes Alejandro had begun to implement. The traditional carpets had been replaced with minimalist designs, and the walls, once adorned with historical paintings, now displayed modern art that seemed out of place in the hotel's classic setting. Javier clenched his fists. As someone who appreciated architecture and design, seeing the essence of the place being dismantled enraged him. When he reached the entrance, he saw his father at his usual post, impeccably dressed in his dark blue uniform. Santiago was helping a family load their luggage into a taxi, with the same dedication that had always defined him. To anyone watching, Santiago showed no signs of the inner conflict he was experiencing. But Javier, who knew his father better than anyone, noticed the slight stiffness in his movements, the hidden tension behind his calm expression. Javier waited patiently for Santiago to finish his task and then approached him. Santiago saw him, and though his face remained impassive, Javier could see the slight glimmer of surprise in his eyes. His presence there meant much more than just a simple visit. Without wasting time, Javier told his father he wanted to talk to him. He knew Santiago wasn't one to ask for help, but he also knew the situation had reached a critical point. Despite his pride, Santiago listened attentively as Javier explained that he was aware of everything Alejandro had been doing. Santiago, as expected, tried to downplay the situation, insisting that he could still handle it. But Javier wasn't accepting that answer. Javier insisted that the situation was no longer just a personal matter. What Alejandro was doing not only affected Santiago, but also the hotel's legacy and, more importantly, the respect for everyone who had worked there for decades. It wasn't just a modernization issue, it was a show of disdain for those who, like his father, had built the hotel's reputation through their daily efforts. Though Santiago tried to remain firm, Javier could see that his father was tired. Not physically, for despite his age, Santiago still had the strength to perform his job. But there was an emotional fatigue, an invisible wound that Alejandro had opened with his disrespectful treatment, his constant insinuations about retirement, and the coldness of his veiled racism. Alejandro didn't see Santiago as a person with history and value, he saw him as an obstacle that needed to be removed so his modern vision could flourish. Javier, determined not to leave his father alone in this fight, promised that he would do everything possible to confront Alejandro. He knew Santiago didn't want to cause problems, that he preferred to face the situation with dignity and without involving others. But Javier wasn't one to sit idly by. He knew the only way to protect his father and his legacy was to address the problem head-on. That same day, Javier decided to speak with some of the hotel's employees. He wanted to understand the opinions of those who, like his father, had worked there for years. Maria, the receptionist, was the first to approach him. With her ever-calm face, though filled with concern, she confirmed what Javier already suspected: Alejandro wasn't just pressuring Santiago, but also other employees who had been working at the hotel for years. Alejandro's vision didn't include anyone who didn't fit his concept of modernization. Javier felt a deep respect for Maria and the other employees who, despite their fear of losing their jobs, were willing to support his father. As they talked, he noticed how their loyalty to Santiago was stronger than any fear. The employees knew that if Santiago fell, they would be next. Alejandro wasn't a man who would stop until he got what he wanted. After speaking with several workers, Javier realized there was more support than his father believed. Not only the older employees, but even some of the younger ones saw Santiago as a symbol of resistance and dignity. Alejandro, with his relentless focus on modernization at any cost, hadn't understood that the hotel wasn't just a luxurious building. It was a community, a family of employees who shared a common history, and Santiago was the heart of that community. With that information in mind, Javier decided it was time to confront Alejandro. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do whatever it took to defend his father. After all, this wasn't just about a job, it was about the dignity of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, a man who didn't deserve to be treated as a disposable object in the name of insensitive modernization. Javier walked toward Alejandro's office, his heart pounding. He knew he was about to confront a powerful man, but he also knew the cause was just. Alejandro, with all his arrogance and disregard for the old, had no idea what was coming. Javier was determined not to back down. As he made his way to Alejandro's office, he felt the strength of his conviction pushing him forward. He knew this wasn't just a dispute between an employee and his boss. It was a battle for respect, dignity, and his father's legacy, as well as for everyone who, like Santiago, had been the pillars of the Real Palace Hotel for decades. He wouldn't allow an arrogant, cold man to dismantle everything his father had built through tireless work. Alejandro's office, located on the top floor of the hotel, reflected everything he stood for: modernity, luxury, and detachment. Upon entering, Javier noticed the cold atmosphere of the place, the minimalist furniture, the abstract art on the walls. It was a space designed more to impress than to welcome. When he reached the reception area, Alejandro's assistant greeted him with a tense smile, asking if he had an appointment. Javier, with a firm tone, replied that he didn't need one. Before she could protest, he walked toward the office door. Alejandro sat behind a large desk, reviewing documents on his computer, wearing the same expression of indifference that was all too familiar to many at the hotel. When he saw Javier enter, he barely looked up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Javier didn't wait for Alejandro to speak. He knew his time was limited and couldn't waste the opportunity. "Santiago is my father." The words came out with obvious emotional weight, a declaration that left no room for misunderstanding. Javier stood in front of Alejandro's desk, his posture firm and his gaze direct. "I want you to understand something very clearly, Alejandro. My father has dedicated his life to this hotel, and what you're doing isn't just unjust, it's an act of contempt for everything this place represents." Alejandro, unfazed, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with an air of superiority. He showed no surprise, not even real annoyance. To him, this was just another inconvenience to deal with. "I'm surprised you came all the way here to talk about this. I think your father already understands that the hotel is in the middle of a transformation. Things change, Javier. Nothing lasts forever, and that includes employees who no longer fit the new needs of the place." Alejandro spoke with that condescending tone that irritated everyone who knew him. It was clear he didn't see Santiago as a person, but as just another piece of the hotel that could be replaced when it was no longer useful. But Javier wasn't intimidated. He knew Alejandro was used to winning, to getting his way, but he wasn't there to negotiate or ask for favors. He was there to demand the respect his father deserved. "What you call a transformation is nothing more than an excuse to dismantle what makes this hotel unique. It's not just a luxury building, it's a place with history, and my father is part of that history. What you're doing isn't modernizing, you're destroying the essence of the real palace and humiliating someone who has been fundamental to its success." Alejandro raised an eyebrow, as if Javier's words amused him. He seemed to enjoy the confrontation, but his response was sharp. "This hotel needs modernization, and I can't let sentimentalities or personal histories get in the way of progress. Santiago has had a long and respectable career, but there comes a time when everyone needs to step aside. I've already offered him a generous compensation. I don't understand why you insist on making this harder than it needs to be." Anger began to simmer inside Javier, but he kept it in check. He knew he couldn't let his emotions take over, at least not yet. Alejandro was calculating, and the only way to confront him was to show that he had logic and support on his side. "The truth is you don't understand what this place means to the people who work here. This hotel isn't just your property to redesign at your whim. It's my father's home, and for many others who've dedicated their lives to making it what it is. And I'm not just talking about the employees. The guests, those who come back year after year, also see my father as a vital part of their experience here." "The name of your father doesn't make this hotel work," Alejandro retorted, clearly losing his patience. "It's the revenue, the investments, the renovations. Feelings don't pay the bills, Javier." But Javier didn't back down. He knew he had one last card to play. "No, they don't. But the guests do, and several of them have already expressed their dissatisfaction with the changes you've implemented. If you continue with this disregard for my father, you could find yourself with a bigger problem than you realize. People don't come here just for the luxurious rooms or the modern renovations. They come because this place offers something others can't: humanity, tradition, a story. And Santiago is a fundamental part of that story. Alejandro stared in silence for a moment, weighing Javier's words. It was clear he hadn't expected such an organized reaction, let alone a threat of losing important customers. Though he tried not to show it, Javier could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "I'm not threatening you, Alejandro," Javier continued, "but if you persist in treating my father this way, I guarantee you won't just lose the respect of the employees, you'll lose the loyalty of many of the guests. The hotel's reputation is at stake, and I won't stand by and watch you destroy it just to impose your vision." The silence in the room was palpable. Alejandro remained still, looking at Javier with a mixture of irritation and calculation. He knew Javier was right in some respects. The hotel's regular guests were the backbone of its success, and losing their loyalty could be disastrous for his expansion plans. However, his ego and desire to assert himself made him resist the idea of backing down. But something changed in that moment. Javier, with his firm stance, conveyed a sense of security that Alejandro hadn't expected. He wasn't just a son defending his father, he was a man ready to fight for what was right, and Alejandro realized that this conflict wouldn't be resolved easily. Finally, Alejandro let out a long, heavy sigh. He knew that proceeding with his plan as originally designed could have serious consequences, but he wasn't willing to completely back down either. "I'll give your father another chance," Alejandro said. "Not because he deserves it, but because I'm not willing to waste more time on this discussion. He can keep working here, but he must adapt. I won't tolerate resistance to change. If he can't, things will change, with or without your intervention." Javier knew this was the best he could get from Alejandro at that moment. He hadn't won the battle entirely, but he had achieved something important. His father would remain at the hotel, at least for now, and that gave him a foundation to keep fighting. Without another word, Javier nodded and left the office, already calculating his next steps. As he returned to the lobby, he found Santiago standing by the entrance, helping a couple of guests. Despite the tension, his posture remained that of a proud man, someone who didn't bend easily. When Santiago saw Javier approaching, his eyes showed a mix of curiosity and concern. Javier explained briefly what had happened. Alejandro had partially relented, but there was still much to do. Santiago, ever the pragmatic man, nodded silently. He didn't need words to understand that his son had done what he would never have asked for but deeply appreciated. With the pressure still in the air, father and son knew that the road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Santiago felt that he wasn't fighting alone. Javier had stepped in, and the employees were united. Alejandro might have won some battles, but the war for Santiago's respect and legacy was far from over. The atmosphere at the Real Palace Hotel shifted subtly but significantly after Javier's confrontation with Alejandro. While the manager wouldn't openly admit it, the employees sensed that something had begun to move in their favor. Alejandro's direct hostility toward Santiago subsided, but his silence didn't mean he had abandoned his desire to remodel everything that represented the hotel's past. The battle for Santiago's future, and in many ways, the future of the Real Palace, remained, only now it was fought in the shadows. The employees closest to Santiago worked with renewed determination, staying united in their support. Maria, the receptionist, who had always been a calm and conciliatory voice, became a key figure in organizing the staff. While the daily routine continued, she discreetly communicated to the employees the importance of staying vigilant and firm. The message was clear: Alejandro should not think he could continue his pressure tactics without consequence. However, Alejandro was not the kind of man to give up easily. Though he had yielded a bit to Javier, he continued to search for ways to execute his plans without provoking an open rebellion. In closed meetings with his partners and investors, Alejandro spoke openly about the need for structural changes at the hotel. Santiago, though no longer mentioned directly, remained the implicit target of his intentions. Alejandro knew he couldn't fire Santiago abruptly, not after the support he had received from both employees and important guests. He needed a pretext, a justification that would make it seem as though his decision was purely professional, without appearing motivated by racism or disdain for long-serving staff. The hotel's atmosphere grew tenser as Alejandro implemented small changes in staff and internal rules. Younger employees, those hired under his supervision, began receiving more privileges, better shifts, and more visible tasks, while older workers were relegated to less appealing duties. Santiago noticed these moves but, as always, maintained his composure. He didn't complain or show weakness. He knew Alejandro was looking for any mistake, any reason to dismiss him, and he didn't intend to give him one. One afternoon, while Santiago was at his usual post helping a group of guests with their luggage, an incident occurred that would change the course of events. Alejandro, accompanied by one of the new reception employees, approached the lobby just as Santiago was seeing off an elderly couple leaving the hotel. The young employee, nervous in the presence of the manager, made a mistake entering the guest's billing information, resulting in an incorrect charge. The problem became evident when the guests returned to the front desk, visibly upset. Santiago, ever attentive, was the first to notice the confusion and, with his usual calm, tried to mediate. While Maria reviewed the documents, Santiago took it upon himself to reassure the guests, promising them that the error would be corrected immediately. However, just then, Alejandro intervened. Looking for any opportunity to discredit Santiago, Alejandro publicly blamed him for the misunderstanding. In a loud voice, in front of the guests and all the staff in the lobby, he accused Santiago of not being attentive enough and contributing to the problem. Alejandro's words echoed with a harshness that left everyone in stunned silence. Santiago, surprised by the unjust accusation, maintained his dignified posture. Despite the public humiliation, he didn't lose his calm. His voice, though serene, carried a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I did not make that mistake. My responsibility is to ensure that our guests receive the best service. And that's what I've done for the past 40 years." Alejandro, clearly enraged by Santiago's resistance, glared at him with disdain. But before he could say anything else, one of the guests, the same man who had had the billing issue, intervened. "This man has done nothing but help us since we arrived here," the man said, looking at Alejandro with eyes full of disgust. "If anyone deserves to be fired, it's not him. You should be looking at your new employees more closely before blaming someone who knows how to do their job." The scene was devastating for Alejandro. For the first time, his authority was publicly questioned by one of the hotel's most influential clients. The murmurs among the employees and other guests in the lobby began to grow. From her position at the front desk, Maria watched Alejandro with a mix of satisfaction and relief. It had been a small blow, but enough to destabilize the manager. From that moment on, the situation began to deteriorate rapidly for Alejandro. The employees, once silent out of fear of reprisals, began to show their support for Santiago more openly. Some of them spoke with regular guests, who, upon hearing about what was happening, also began to express their dissatisfaction with the manager's decisions. One of the hotel's major shareholders, an elderly man who had been a close friend of the former manager, Don Julio, heard about the incident and requested a meeting with Alejandro. The encounter was far from friendly. The shareholder made it clear that he disagreed with how Alejandro was handling the situation with Santiago and that if he continued down this path, the investors might reconsider their support. Alejandro found himself at a crossroads. The modernization plan he had proposed was in jeopardy, not only because of internal resistance from the staff but also because of the threat of losing regular guests and investor support. Santiago, by simply doing his job with the same dedication as always, had achieved the unthinkable. Alejandro was isolated. Days later, the pressure became unbearable for Alejandro. Discontent from the guests grew. Criticism from the veteran employees, combined with the visible support Santiago received from everyone, began to undermine the manager's authority. Finally, in a private meeting with the hotel's board, Alejandro was called to account. The verdict was clear: his vision of modernization had created more problems than it had solved, and the conflict with Santiago was the last straw. Alejandro had no choice but to resign. His departure was quiet, without the fanfare that had marked his arrival. The arrogance that had accompanied him from the beginning crumbled. The hotel staff, while not openly celebrating, felt the relief in the air. Santiago, for his part, continued in his post with the same dignity that had characterized him for decades. There was no need for grand speeches or raised voices. His mere presence, his silent resistance, and the respect he had earned over the years were more than enough to stand up to the man who had tried to take away what rightfully belonged to him. Alejandro's exit from the Real Palace Hotel was like a sigh of relief that swept through every corner of the building. No ceremonies, no emotional farewells. The man who had tried to dismantle not only the hotel's legacy but also Santiago's left like a shadow fading away, leaving behind the traces of his failed attempts to modernize at the expense of the hotel's very essence. For Santiago, there was no euphoria, no celebration. His nature had always been humble, and while he felt a quiet satisfaction in having survived the storm that Alejandro had brought with him, he knew that the real challenge had not been winning, but staying true to himself, resisting with dignity, without losing the respect of those around him. His routine hadn't changed. He still rose every morning at the same time, with the same neatly pressed uniform, the same firm steps, and his calm voice greeting guests at the entrance of the Real Palace. However, something fundamental had changed. Santiago now walked through the hotel corridors with a calmness he hadn't felt in a long time. The looks from his colleagues, once filled with worry, were now full of pride. He had fought against a powerful force, and although it wasn't a visible or violent struggle, his peaceful resistance had left a deep mark on everyone. The younger employees, who initially didn't understand the importance of his presence, now looked at him with admiration. Even those who had arrived under Alejandro's management began to realize that Santiago wasn't just an older man working in an outdated position. He was the beating heart of the hotel. The biggest change, however, came from the new leadership. After Alejandro's departure, the board of directors decided they needed someone who understood both the value of tradition and the importance of innovation. And there was no one better for the role than Javier Gonzalez. Santiago's son, with his experience as an architect and his passion for preserving the essence of the Real Palace, took on the role of general manager with a clear mission: to balance the old with the new. Javier's first day as manager was symbolic. He didn't make any grand announcements or propose drastic changes. His first action was simple yet powerful: he gathered all the staff in the hotel lobby for an informal talk. There, in front of everyone, Javier spoke honestly about what the hotel meant to him, not just as Santiago's son, but as someone who had grown up admiring the legacy of the place. The Real Palace Hotel isn't just a building. This place is a community, a family. And my father, Santiago, is an essential part of that family. Here, we respect tradition, but we also look to the future with the intention of improving without destroying what makes us unique. His words resonated with everyone present. The employees, both veterans and newcomers, felt that someone had finally arrived who understood what the hotel needed, a balance between innovation and the preservation of what had always been important. Under Javier's leadership, the hotel began to renew itself organically. The renovations weren't abandoned, but each change was carefully planned to respect the hotel's classic spirit. Javier worked closely with architects and designers, ensuring that every decision reflected not just modernization, but also respect for the stories that lived within the walls of the real palace. Santiago, for his part, was formally recognized for his decades of service. In a discreet but emotional ceremony, the hotel's board presented him with a commemorative plaque, thanking him for his loyalty, dedication, and for being the soul of the real palace for more than 40 years. Though he wasn't one for grand speeches, Santiago accepted the recognition with humility, saying simply that it had been an honor to serve so many people and that true success wasn't measured by how long one worked, but by doing things right, with respect and commitment. For many employees, Santiago became a role model. He was no longer just the doorman who greeted guests. He was a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity, showing how one could confront disrespect and injustice without losing dignity. His legacy was no longer just about the time he had worked at the hotel, but what he had left in the hearts of everyone he had met. The hotel also experienced a renaissance. With Javier at the helm and peace restored after Alejandro's departure, guests began to notice the changes. The balanced renovations, attention to detail, and above all, the warm and welcoming spirit that had never been lost, but now flourished more strongly than ever, were evident. Regular customers returned more frequently, and new visitors arrived, attracted not only by the luxury of the place but by its reputation as a hotel where tradition and respect were fundamental. Under its new leadership, the hotel found a new way to shine. The renovated hallways retained the elegance of the past, but with modern touches that didn't overshadow its essence. Javier, with his father's wisdom and his own vision as an architect, had achieved what Alejandro never could, to move the real palace forward without forgetting where it came from. One afternoon, several months after Alejandro's departure, Javier found his father at the hotel entrance, as always, attentive and dedicated. The lobby was buzzing with life, families arriving, couples taking pictures in the grand lobby, employees smiling at guests. Javier approached Santiago, and for a moment, they stood in silence, watching the peaceful bustle of the hotel. "The hotel is in good hands now," Javier said with a smile, breaking the silence. Santiago nodded slightly, knowing that his son had understood the most important thing, that the real palace wasn't just a building to be remodeled at will. It was a home to many, a story built day by day, not with bricks or marble, but with the people who inhabited it. With his gaze fixed on the horizon, Santiago knew his fight was over. He had defended what was right and had triumphed without losing himself in the process. The hotel, his home for more than 4 decades, was now ready for a new beginning, a future that honored the past while looking forward with hope. If you enjoyed this touching story of resilience and the fight for dignity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Give the video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought about Santiago's journey. Your opinion is very important to us. And of course, don't miss the video appearing on the end screen now, I'm sure you're going to love it. See you next time.